As you make your way to your seats and give your last hugs and greetings before you sit down, I am encouraged by the conversations. I've heard people reflecting on the panels. I've heard people reflecting on assumptions made. And I have just heard rich conversations and dialogue between people who may not have known each other prior to today. The conference is doing exactly what it has been designed to do, and we're getting us talking. I am reluctant to call any of our sessions features because, in fact, the features are at each table. Because what you choose to do beyond today is what is most important. While you will be fed both physically and spiritually and academically, most of what you do, if you don't digest it or choose to and use it in ways that impact your spheres of influence, this whole series will be for naught, and we are not going to have that be so. And I just thank you again for your commitment to doing the deep dive that you've been doing. I've heard that all of the sessions have had wonderful engagement and that you all are absorbing information and thinking of ways that you can take this back to your relative spheres of influence. And so I'm going to ask that Clint Smith return to the dais, and he will do and make introductions for our next session. Let's give Clint a round of applause as he comes forward. And
Hello,
so,
everyone.
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
So I know we got a group of teachers here, and so want to make sure that I know folks are still getting their lunch, and folks are kind of coming back from their session, but want to make sure that we have I don't know what people do what their sort of pedagogical practices are to build on our conversation this morning, but definitely want to make sure we I don't want to have to put my hand up and wait for everybody to put theirs up too, but if we could all just come back to the space and give our full attention to the folks coming up. So just as the panel this morning was an incredible honor for me, as is this one, as the folks coming up, Michelle Alexander and Judith Browne-Dianis are some of are at the forefront of this work. They are at the forefront of our work around our carceral system and what it means to dismantle it. They are at the forefront of this work with regard to understanding how all of our systems fit into one another, the sort of ecosystem of social phenomena that we were talking about this morning. And we are so lucky that we get to, I feel so lucky that I get to see and be a part of those two in conversation with one another, because I think, and one of the things I really appreciate about the model of this conference is that it is conversational, right? That it is based on dialogue rather than having people speak to give a sort of traditional keynote. As moving as those can be, I think having a range of different voices and perspectives in conversation with one another, pushing back against one another, building off of one another, creates a much more dynamic experience for everyone. And so I'm not going to read the full bios again. I think, I find that tiresome when people read the bios that you have in front of them. But you know who these folks are, and I'd like to invite them to the stage, and we'll get this conversation started. So there's a lot to think about, a lot to cover, and we are thinking at this conference sort of in a macro level, generally about the relationship between our prison system and our school systems. But Michelle, to start with you, obviously, so many folks know you for your seminal work on the new Jim Crow, and I wanted to start by thinking about, that book was published almost a decade ago now, which means you were writing it more than a decade ago. And I'm curious, and our sort of social and political landscape in many ways looks very different than it did when you were, in many ways looks different than what it did when you were writing it, and perhaps in many ways doesn't look that different at all. And so I'm curious if you could kind of ground us in a sense of how you've seen this system, sort of system of mass incarceration and and its adjacent systems. How has that changed over the course since you first published your book? And in what ways do you think we are moving forward? And in what ways do you think that we are in need of more work than ever?
Well, thank you. I just first want to say how happy I am to be here with two people I deeply admire and whose work I really respect, and so many of you who I'm seeing again after some time apart, but also this convening in this conference, is so encouraging, and just glad to be part of it. In terms of what's changed and what's remained the same over the past decade or more, I have to say, I feel as though everything has changed and everything has remained the same. One thing that has changed that I just discovered this morning is that someone who I met in Graterford Prison nearly a decade ago, right after my book was released, I went to Graterford to speak to a group of men behind bars who were reading my book, and I met someone who was sentenced to life without parole, and he's here today. Will you stand up? That has changed. That has changed. And so I know that for myself, there are times when I can find myself pessimistic and depressed. And I think it's important for us to celebrate when people come home and when we do actually win even what may seem, in the grand scheme of things, to be small victories, but that can change the course of people's lives and their families' lives. And so over the past 10 years, I think to just situate when the book was first released. It was released right after Obama was elected president of the United States, and our country was awash in post-racialism. We had overcome. And I found it nearly impossible in the first 2 years after the book was released to get anybody to read it or want to talk about it. And, I was speaking in, the basement of churches, begging friends to invite me to come speak to a group of friends and activists.
And it's something I don't think many people realize is that for the first year or a couple of years, as you said, after the book was released, it actually wasn't the monumental hit that it became.
No, I couldn't get it reviewed. And it was a real struggle. And it was grassroots folks, organizers and activists, who pushed the book from the margins to the center. I was just speaking with Miriam about the fact that Philip Jackson from Chicago, who ran the Black Star Project there and who was working on issues of educational equity, was among the people who first really seized the book and said, this is the story of why my kids are failing in schools because their parents are cycling in and out of prisons. And so over the past 10 years, we've seen, thanks in large part to an extraordinary movement following the uprisings in Ferguson, we've seen just a spectacular organizing and activism. The book came out before Trayvon Martin was killed, before Ferguson, before any of that, before all the videos went viral of police killings. And we have, over the past decade, lived through a period of time of extraordinary organizing, activism, courage, movement building. And yet, in so many ways, things have remained the same. What followed with Obama, obviously, was President Trump. And sort of ironically, we now are at a moment where we supposedly have a bipartisan consensus for criminal justice reform. and a president who's pretty much openly a white nationalist. When I was writing the book, we were in an era of post-racialism when everyone was denying that old school overt bigotry was a thing, but we were ratcheting up a drug war. And now we have a bipartisan consensus, supposedly, that we need to downsize our prison system, but bigotry is wide out in the open for everyone to see. And as much as, I know many people are celebrating kind of the progress, in quotes, that's been made in terms of criminal justice reform, I think we have to count all the people who are locked in immigrant detention centers today among those who are behind bars. And so it is not the case that our system is shrinking today. The system has morphed and evolved and continues to expand. And it expands not only through the system of mass deportation, but we are also finding that the system has been able to co-opt many reform efforts, like bail reform, for example, which is being hijacked by efforts to put people on electronic monitors. And you see the expansion of digital prisons and electronic monitoring, where I fear if we do not get our arms around this phenomenon, that in 10 years, we will have double, triple the number of people under electronic surveillance monitoring today. We'll have all these communities under digital surveillance. We won't need brick and mortar prisons anymore because we have a high-tech system of surveillance that keeps people trapped in their apartments, on their block, in their neighborhoods. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that although there is much to be celebrated in terms of the courageous movement building that has arisen, particularly the leadership of formerly incarcerated people and what they have been able to accomplish, prison strikes that have occurred under incredibly oppressive conditions, that we now are in a moment in time which, politically speaking, in terms of the political dynamics that are at play, are not much different than existed a couple decades ago when the war on drugs was first born.
And building off of that, before we hop to Judith, I think, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this as well, part of what you mentioned in the new Jim Crow is the necessity for a massive social movement around this issue, and a massive social movement to bring awareness, and not only to bring awareness, but to push our public officials to move in the opposite direction in a fundamental way. And I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the sort of social movements that have arisen and been catalyzed from the uprisings that have happened in different cities across the country. And when you were writing the book, I mean, when you think about the social movements you were imagining in 2009, 2010, did they look like this, or do you think that what role have these social movements that are in existence now played in pushing this issue forward and to move toward mass decarceration? Is a different type of movement necessary, a sort of adjacent movement, a movement that is an extension of the ones that have existed both on a national and exist in local levels? And I guess I'm curious how, because we didn't anticipate, there's no way necessarily to have anticipated everything that would happen following the book, but I'm curious what your sense of the social movements that were necessary when you were writing the book and how they line up with the movements that have taken place over the past few years.
Well, I would say that when I was writing the book, I was trying to sound an alarm. I didn't have, and I still don't have, a roadmap, blueprint for what kind of movement will save us. And, I want to stress that, I find that very often people say, oh, you were writing a book about mass incarceration, you were writing a book about the drug war. In my mind, I was writing a book about the cyclical rebirth of caste-like systems in America. it wasn't, mass incarceration is the current manifestation of it, and now we have mass deportation as well, and we have a rise of digital prisons as well. But what I was hoping was that we would build movements that would help to end once and for all this cycle of creating these enormous systems of racial and social control in this country. And that's a different task than just reducing the rate of incarceration in the United States. Many of the folks who are building movements, folks from the movement Black Lives and beyond, do have a deeply transformational, revolutionary consciousness in the work. And they do not necessarily have the answers, but they are striving to figure out what it means to reimagine what our justice systems look like, reimagine what our education systems look like, rethink how we do democracy on a local level as well as a national level. Those kinds of conversations are absolutely essential. And I'm inspired by them and challenged by them. What I worry about are those advocacy efforts that are focused primarily on trying to fix a system that is actually not designed to serve us. And, you know, again, I think some examples of this are, you know, in response to police killings, many activists embraced police body cameras as a solution. This will be a way to fix the problem of police getting away with murder. But those body cameras face outwards. Those body cameras are not actually filming the police. The body cameras are filming every single person that the police come into contact with. All of that footage, all of that film gets to be used in plea bargaining to force folks to cop a plea, gets to be used at trial, can be used to, you know, remove kids from custody. We were advocating as activists, civil rights advocates, for more surveillance of our communities in the hopes of catching a few bad cops. And I think that when we find ourselves trapped within the logic of the system, we kind of find ourselves using the master's tools to try to dismantle the master's house, thinking more surveillance will solve the problem. When in fact, we wind up kind of capitulating to the birth of a new form of high-tech surveillance and control of our communities that may wind up being more damaging in some ways than the one that we already have. And so I'm most hopeful about those advocacy efforts that are working towards reimagining what our justice system is. And that means the transformative justice work at places like Project NIA. It's work of folks like Dream Defenders and IP 100, and work that's happening at the Advancement Project to kind of reimagine what happens in our schools so that kids aren't funneled straight into prisons. But if we think that we can just tinker with this machine and somehow get it right and not wrestle with the reality that the way these institutions are now built are actually really designed not for the flourishing of poor folks and poor folks of color, but are really designed for their containment and control, I think we will just find ourselves being complicit in the perpetual reinvention of systems of control rather than dismantling and building out of the ashes something new that will really serve us in the long run.
And Judith, you and the Advancement Project are at the center of a lot of this coalition building, right? And a lot of the sort of movement work that has happened, you all are clearly stakeholders and have been leaders, and I'm kind of curious about what the process, you know, this is such a mass set of issues, so many issues that are entangled with one another. And you have a lot of people who want to move ostensibly toward the same goal, but have very different conceptions and very different notions of what it takes to get there, or what it looks like to get there. And I'm curious for you and your experience as a leader of one of the organizations that's been at the center of this work, what is it like to try to build a diverse, sort of pluralistic coalition, while also not acquiescing to a sort of regret, as Michelle was alluding to, a sort of regressive way to think about fixing systems rather than transforming them.
Well, first, I want to say thank you for having me here. It is such a pleasure to be with Michelle. We've never been on a panel together, and I haven't seen her in a really long time. And Clint, it's my first time meeting. And to have Michelle and Miriam, who I had a fangirl moment outside. I followed her to the bathroom so that I could meet her, which is crazy that we've not met before. So I want to start there. But I also, before answering your question, want to bring into the room a few people that I do the work for. One of whom is Jaisha, who was, you may remember, a 5-year-old girl who was beat up by the police in school. It was back in 2005, and I still do the work in her name in Pinellas, Florida. I also want to bring into the room Kayshawn, Kayshawn and also Ahmad, who locally here in this area were accosted by the police at Woodlands Hills High School and beat up. One who lost his teeth, the other who was put in a chokehold by police in schools. And so I want to bring them into the room because this is important for us to remember why we do the work and who we do the work for. So Clint, I think to your question, it is hard doing the work. But for Advancement Project, I would say we're left of left. We are unapologetic about who we are. We are always pushing the envelope and hoping that people will dream with us. And so it means that we may say crazy things like, we have a campaign called Police Free Schools with the Alliance for Educational Justice. And yeah, we said it because we're dreaming about it and we're working towards it. And so I think in movement space, and for those who don't know us, we are an organization started 20 years ago this year. We started with the idea that lawyers need to get back to what was best about the civil rights movement, that we were connected to movement, that we weren't just bringing litigation for litigation's sake. Right? As I say, the revolution will not be litigated. And that we had to work with movements and support them. And we needed to also do communications work because we need to change hearts and minds. And so for us, we are always thinking about how can we push people and they will follow. When we started our work around school to prison pipeline, we started literally when we opened our doors in 1999. And it wasn't called that then. Right? It was called, what the hell is happening? These kids are getting kicked out. Then we figured out, there's this thing called zero tolerance. I wrote this report in 2000 around zero tolerance. We didn't know what the heck it was, right? But we knew kids were getting pushed out. And so over time, right, we started off with, we're gonna reduce suspensions. We're gonna be good with this. We're gonna make sure that teachers have all the resources that they need. Schools have all the resources they need. We're going to decrease those suspensions. Then we're like, oh my God, there's cops in schools. Found that out probably in about 2005, did a report on that. Oh my God, this is crazy. They're actually arresting these kids. And so school to prison pipeline still had not been called into being as a name. And, we moved into the idea that we should just make sure that they're trained well. Make sure that they're doing the right thing and we're limiting them. And they were like, hell no. And I think this gets to the point that you raised, Michelle, which is as much as our movements have done incredible work to change. And I'll tell you, the school to prison pipeline movement, I think is, I'm a little biased, but I think it is probably one of the strongest movements that we've had in a long time. It's intergenerational. It's young people at the front. With people supporting them and them calling into being the existence that they want to see. And I think that movement has shown that we have had some wins, but the system morphs. The system adapts. The system changes to do the same thing that it was doing under a different name. And so that also means that the movement can't end, right? That you've got to be vigilant, that you've got to keep figuring out, okay, It's like in our voting rights work, we always think about, okay, if I were going to steal an election, how would I do that, right? Like you gotta like figure out what is the next thing that the system is gonna do and how are you gonna respond to it? And so that means it's always ever changing. And in this work, in particular in school to prison pipeline, we learned early on that like teachers were gonna be our hardest group to get on board because they were the front line, right? And they're like, hell, these kids are bad. They're just bad. They're not bad. That's what the last generation said about your generation. Every generation says that about the next generation. And by the way, maybe it's the teachers that are bad, some of them, right? We always talk about the kids. Let's talk about ourselves. Adults mess up kids. Kids don't mess up kids. So it was important at some point to do a pivot to try and get teachers on board. So we started working with the unions. Come on along, y'all. You know, we had to figure out that it was educational outcomes that they would care about, right? And so we showed, like, if I'm out of the classroom, I'm not learning. If I'm not learning, I'm not passing that test. If I'm not passing that test, your school's gonna get closed down, reconstituted. You're all gonna get fired. So you might as well try and keep us in the classroom and get us learning, right? And so had to get them on board. That was difficult. It's been difficult. It's an ongoing struggle, right? Working with national unions, but knowing that we couldn't do the work without having teachers at the table, getting them to understand and getting them to think and dream with us about what could be different in their classrooms.
How do you make teachers feel, to this point, how do you make teachers feel as if they, because I think, you know, again, having been a teacher, there's a tension in some sense because there are a lot of people who come into classrooms, and I'm not saying this is what you're doing, but there are a lot of people who come into classrooms and try to tell teachers how to do their jobs and who've never been in the classroom, and they're like, you're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong, why don't you do this? And you're like, you come do this for a day, right? That's the initial instinct. We're like, you sit down, right? Like, and so I'm wondering how you go about making teachers feel like stakeholders in this work and how you make them feel empowered to ground these conversations and the ways in which we can imagine a sort of transformative way of operating in these spaces. How do you make them feel as if they are not being talked at, but that you are exchanging ideas with them, and that they are sort of partners in this sort of reimagining?
So I think it's been a journey, right? Of like, yep, we're talking at you, drop the mic, you know. I remember I spoke at an AFT convention and at like a civil rights thing that they had. I haven't been invited back. And for real. But it was because I was truth-telling in ways that made people feel uncomfortable. And I need people to feel uncomfortable, right? I can't get free if you don't feel uncomfortable, because my people are not free. And so we all have to feel uncomfortable. And so I think, you know, this has been a like, let's tell you about the statistics. Okay, whatever, right? What about my classroom? Okay, let's give you some alternatives, right? But really important is also for teachers to understand, and administrators, to understand the connection to mass incarceration, right? That it's not just about that this is a feeder system, but actually we have used all the failed policies that we have used in the criminal legal system, we have adapted for our schools. And that punishment mindset that Miriam talked about earlier is what we do. And super predator, Hillary Clinton, we are still undoing the damage. And people aren't ready to face that. That when they walk into a classroom, I sat through some focus groups of teachers, white teachers, and I will never forget a teacher, because I was on the other side of the glass, you can't see me. And so I'm watching, and this white woman, young white woman saying, but those black boys, they're so big and scary. Super predator, right? And so until we realize that in our heads, in our policies, we have dehumanized black and brown children, right? We are thinking about them as threats to us. When we start talking about and we talked about the morphing of the system, threat assessments in schools now. How are we going to stop the next shooter? We're going to do threat assessments where we're going to have police and teachers and guidance counselors and mental health folks all at the table to help us with threat assessments that are using the same racist algorithms that we're using in the criminal justice system, and that we're going to say that we're doing it because we have threats. We have children, we don't have threats. We have somebody's baby in a classroom, we don't have threats. We have young people, why don't we call them supports, not threat assessments? And by the way, when you do those threat assessments, they're not gonna point to the white boy who is gonna be the next shooter. It's gonna be all the other children. So I think that like having the political education for teachers is very important, and for them to understand what happens when you call the cop into the classroom. A lot of teachers don't know what actually happens after that. They're like, oh, you mean the kid got booked? You mean the kid got arrested? Yeah, cops arrest people. They enforce the law and criminal codes. They're not counselors. Stop calling them SROs. They're not. They're cops. And so having that political education is important, but giving people the tools to do something different. And that's the work that we also do also, is thinking about restorative justice and working towards restorative justice. We've got pilots that we work on where restorative justice is about the culture of a school. It's not about a program. It's about how we treat each other. Do we say hello in the morning when you walk through the door? So being able to give them the tools to do something different is key, because a lot of teachers want to do the right thing. Not all, but a lot.
And I'm really interested in this idea of political education. I'm glad you brought this up. And Michelle, obviously, your book has been used as a tool of political education for millions of people. And I'm curious, and you talked about what it meant to, you spent years just like going into church basements and schools and living rooms and anywhere that would have you, and you know, over time those spaces and audiences got bigger. But I'm curious about, and Judith was touching on this a bit, but how the difference between a group of people becoming aware of something and then those people then implementing a different way of doing the work in, you know, in this context in their classrooms, or I mean, and it doesn't have to speak necessarily specifically to teachers, but you've spoken to people in every sector of work. And I'm curious, to the extent that you know, when people hear or are made aware of the history that you outline that links this historical reality to this contemporary phenomenon, what has to happen after that for someone to go from simply like knowing a set of statistics, or knowing what the drug war did, or knowing the relationship of slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration, to then behaving differently in the world?
I think it's extremely challenging because all of us have been socialized to view the others with suspicion and some real punitiveness. You know, it's not just the Republicans or the white suburbanites, or it's something we've all, you know, breathed. It's part of the air. It's part of what our capitalist, you know, society teaches us, that, you know, there's winners and losers, as Donald Trump likes to say, and he's a winner, right? There's us and there's them, and those who have failed because they deserve to fail. And I think that mentality can be found within all of us. And because our institutions are not designed in a way that is supportive of those who are trying to respond to those who are failing, quote unquote, with real care, compassion, and concern, our systems are designed to respond with punitiveness. It can be very hard to change on your own, to go to a single teacher and say, well, now you individually need to start treating your students differently and not kick them out of the classroom, when no one around you is supporting you in that effort, when nothing in the community is supporting you in that effort. It can be extraordinarily difficult to by yourself suddenly be part of the change. And that's why I think it's absolutely essential for us to think about organizing. And organizing isn't, I think a lot of times when people hear the term organizing, they think immediately, oh, I have to be out there knocking on doors and pounding the pavement. But organizing can start right where you are in your school, where you are saying, we need to have a conversation about what's happening in our school. I want to find, a handful of other like-minded people or people who might be open to have a conversation about what can we do right here to respond without purely a punitive response to young folks in our schools. And that requires people to act with courage, to speak the truth about their own experience, what they've witnessed, how they themselves have been perhaps complicit in it. I'm behaving in a way in my classroom I'm not proud of. I need help, I need support. And to reach out to other teachers or other administrators and begin to not just problem solve, but to gather information to better understand how the experience is situated within the context of their community, within the context of our political moment, within the context of mass incarceration, within the context of the disposability of certain groups of people defined by race and by class. But it's not something I think that any of us can do it alone. And I think we're also struggling to some extent because, I have to talk about the fact that, back when we were challenging the old Jim Crow, right? There were national organizations that were focused like a laser on that mission that had a real grassroots base, right? I mean, the NAACP back then was considered a radical organization. You could be killed in some parts for having your name on an NAACP membership list. CORE is a national grassroots organization that was membership based, that had roots in communities. And if you wanted to join the movement, you can join SNCC. You could eventually join the Black Panther Party. You knew what the on-ramp was, right? I want to join the movement, and there was a place to go. And you could be part of it, and you'd be part of a community of people who are engaged in political education and who were engaged with building with people, from across the country. And I think right now, many people kind of wake up and go, okay, I get that it's wrong. I've read some books. I've watched the 13th. And I want to do something, but I have no idea where to go. I don't know what the on-ramp is. And I think one of the challenges that we face in this movement isn't to replicate what was done, decades ago. A different kind of movement building is required, but to think more carefully and strategically about how we can make it easier for ordinary folks who want to contribute to the movement, to get connected and get active right where they are. To some extent, Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives began to provide those kinds of opportunities. But I think we're going to have to think more creatively and courageously in the months and years to come if we're going to make it possible for people, no matter where they are, to easily feel connected to movement work that's happening right where they are.
And given that, as you spoke to, the same sort of infrastructure or organizing infrastructure as existed during the civil rights movement, I wouldn't say doesn't exist, but looks different now. I imagine you've gotten this question for a decade at like everything you've gone to, but people show up to these things and they read your book and they watch the 13th and they see, now when they see us and they're like, I want to do something. And so given the fact that there isn't the same type of infrastructure to say, go join CORE, go join this, what do you, and you as well, Judith, what do you say to people who are like, I know this is wrong, I see this sort of racial caste system and the various manifestations of it across our country, across the world. What do I do? Like, what do you tell people?
It's difficult. Yeah. And, I don't have a pat response for every place I go because every community is very different. There are some communities where it actually makes a lot of sense to go join your local NAACP. There are communities where that is not necessarily a good option for joining movement work that will be truly transformational. And so I do not have a pat answer. What I do know is that in virtually all communities, let me put it this way, I don't think I've been to a community yet, including those that exist behind bars, where there aren't already people who are doing the work in deeply meaningful ways. And so part of the challenge is for people to begin to figure it out. Who in my community can I connect with? First, who in my place of work, who in my church or faith community, who on my block, who on my neighborhood, and then who is already doing the work that I am interested in or I might be able to plug into or support in some way. And I don't think that there is an easy, obvious answer that works everywhere. There isn't a national grassroots organization that exists today that's focused like a laser on ending mass incarceration and mass deportation. But there are a lot of organizations, fantastic organizations, and individuals and faith groups and groups of teachers and students, youth groups, people behind bars, outside, formerly incarcerated folks who are doing work in just about every other community. And it's gonna take some work to figure it out, but that's what's necessary if we're going to move beyond sort of these piecemeal, isolated efforts into something that is far more connected and rooted in local communities.
I mean, I don't really have anything to add. I think that's right. And I just for educators, I think, getting to like the school to prison pipeline stuff, get some study groups together in your building, in your district. We helped Baltimore over a period of time doing study groups, and they brought in speakers to learn about different stuff and like what's working in different places. And I think it's just like Michelle said, it's like start where you are.
And so to speak directly to the school to prison pipeline, I just want to bring some numbers here to help us ground this conversation. So we know that according to a nationwide study by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights a few years ago, African-American students are 3.5 times more likely than their white classmates to be suspended or expelled. We know that Black children constitute 18% of students, but they account for 46% of those who are suspended more than once. We know that students with disabilities are also at a profound risk here. One report found that while 8.6% of public school children have been identified as having disabilities that affect their ability to learn, these students make up 32% of the young people in juvenile detention centers. So with all we know, with all the data we have, I'm curious, both sort of why are we still in this position? Because I think part of there was a movement at one point to just get this data, because this data didn't exist, and we were, you had a lot of folks sort of screaming into the void, who were like, there's a problem, but we didn't have the scale of empirical evidence with which to identify it. And in your experience, Judith, have these trends been increasing? Have they been decreasing? And are there spaces and places in the country that have been that serve as models for what it looks like to not only mitigate, but to fundamentally disrupt and dismantle this pipeline, or as we talked about before, this sort of entangled apparatus of systems? Are there places that are doing that well? Are there places that are doing it poorly? And what can we learn from those spaces?
So nationally, the numbers are going down some. The racial disparities still exist, although that gap is shrinking a little bit. We are seeing more Black girls suspended and arrested, right? This is the work that's around like, oh, Black girls, they're wild. They're sassy, they talk back too much. And so we're seeing that as a trend. I do think, so the trajectory of this movement has been like starting from not knowing what it was, to calling it, to we're gonna attack suspensions first, then when Obama came in, getting the federal government on board. The data have been there, the school suspension data, but not the arrest data. So we got that with the Obama administration. We got a federal guidelines and guidance for school districts so they could know what it looks like when there's a problem and they can come in and investigate a civil rights problem. And we got a federal government that actually called it the school to prison pipeline. I will tell you, one of my greatest joys was being on a phone call that was a public call, and Secretary Arne Duncan was on, and Attorney General Eric Holder were on, and it actually wasn't a public call, it was for civil rights folks. And to hear the two of them calling, saying, we're gonna stop the school to prison pipeline. Now, Arne Duncan had been the CEO in Chicago when I wrote a report that outed them on the arrest data, which they had never looked at because the Chicago Police Department had it. And when he was CEO, he was like, oh my God, we have a problem. And so to go from there to hearing him say, we've got to stop this, actually was important for the movement to know that, and I think about this with the movement for Black Lives also, it's we took it from the streets to the White House. You have to understand the power in that. For people who always feel on the margins and disenfranchised, right? To have that happen. So now we have this other person living in the White House, and he, and his person at the Department of Education got rid of the federal guidelines and the guidance, and which opens the door to all kinds of civil rights problems. We don't think that's gonna happen. I think the conversation has changed. I think just like Michelle with, the new Jim Crow, a conversation has changed. And I think the fact that teachers for a long time did not wanna call it the school to prison pipeline because they didn't wanna acknowledge that they were part of that. And now they do talk about it. And then now they're like, oh, we don't wanna be part of that, right? When we started off, we really had a strategy around making zero tolerance a toxic phrase. We had a communication strategy around that. And so that no one would want to be guilty of using zero tolerance, which meant that they were also going to change the policy. And we saw that happen, right? School to prison pipeline. People are like, oh, I don't want to be part of that. And so people are saying, we got to have a conversation about this and do some work. And so I think it is shifting, but like I said, now what we see is some school districts that are like, okay, we've gotten rid of, and I want to say that it's not because everybody in education said this is a bad thing. It's because there was a movement that we want to get rid of the low-level offenses for suspensions, right? And the ones that are subjective, like disorderly, disrespectful. What does disrespect mean? Disobedience. People would say yesterday I had an incident in the airport where a white man would probably say I was disrespectful to him because I told him to get in the back of the line behind me. And so disrespectful is in the eye of the beholder, right? And so some districts have gotten rid of that. But then what did they do? Their numbers didn't change because then they did exactly what happens in the criminal legal system is they upcharged young people, right? Okay, that wasn't disorderly, that's actually an assault now. And so this really is about whether or not there's the leadership and the folks in the classroom who are pushing for the change that we want to see.
Michelle, you wrote a really important piece in the New York Times a few months ago on the idea of violence and how we sort of collectively conceive of violence and how so much of the mythology around issues of mass incarceration are tied to this idea that the vast majority of people in prison and in jail had a dime bag of weed on the corner, and if we simply get rid of all the quote unquote nonviolent drug offenders, then we will end mass incarceration. When we know that that's not empirically true, we know the majority of people who are incarcerated are not nonviolent drug offenders. We know even the phrase, this sort of the false demarcation of what constitutes as violent and nonviolent is far more opaque and far more contingent upon what state you're in or what color your skin is, and that these laws are not static, that they are decisions that are made. What constitutes as violent or what constitutes as nonviolent are decisions that are made by people in positions of authority that are contingent on a range of factors beyond the act itself. And you talked about how important it is for us to reckon with violence, and that if we want to actually have a meaningful conversation about moving away from mass incarceration and more generally, I think, with you were talking about and thinking about sort of restorative justice and transformational justice, that we have to talk about, reckon with this idea of violence, because otherwise what happens is we continue to have policies in which sort of morality is imputed onto the violent offender, quote unquote, and the nonviolent offender, and people who have engaged in harm, who have either been on the receiving end and who have enacted it. Oftentimes, it's as you talk about, it's both, are thrown under the bus when policy comes around, because it is not seen as politically feasible or politically palatable to say this person may have committed real harm against this person or this group of people, and that does not mean that we should put that person in a cage for the rest of their lives. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you think we need to do better in the ways that we talk about the issue of violence?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. There's a lot that I want to unpack. First, I've received a lot of questions around, like, why in the book did I focus specifically on the drug war and kind of highlight the mass arrests for nonviolent drug offenses when the percentage of people behind bars for simple drug possession is relatively low. And the reason is because at the time that I was writing the book, a drug war was being waged in which people were being rounded up, swept off the street, charged with these offenses, and then often released with just felony probation. They might not do any time, so if you look behind bars, you may not find that person there, but they now are saddled with a felony record that will follow them for the rest of their lives, that may deny them the right to vote, maybe deny them access to food stamps, deny them access to public housing, keep them trapped in a second-class citizenship for the rest of their lives. And so from my perspective, it's critically important that when we talk about ending mass incarceration, that we're not just counting bodies behind bars to determine whether we're making progress or not, that we're asking whether we are uprooting this caste-like system that labels people, brands people, disposes of them, makes it impossible or extraordinarily difficult for them to find housing, get access to education, to care for themselves and their families. That we're trying to uproot that system. It's not just about who's behind bars and who's outside. But I think, unfortunately, many people have got into their heads that the real problem is that there's too many nonviolent drug offenders behind bars, and if we just attack that problem, then somehow the system of mass incarceration will just kind of crumble of its own weight, and that is clearly false. And I think what we need to focus on is not just violence, but what counts as violence. And by that, I'm not even talking about who gets labeled a violent offender, like, oh, you shove someone in the hallway, and is that a violent assault, or are you going to call it something else? But instead, the way in which state violence has been rendered invisible. So, for example, if we really pause and think about what an arrest is, it's a kidnapping, right? When a police officer shows up and drags you off the street, puts you in handcuffs, shoves you in a car, and then takes you somewhere where you're locked in a cage. If a private person did that to another private person, that would be kidnapping. Everyone would understand that that was violence, that that was a violent crime, and that the person who experienced it would suffer trauma. That when you got out of that cage, when you were released from being kidnapped, that you would suffer trauma that would be deserving of care and concern, perhaps treatment, therapy, whatever. But we don't view all of the hundreds of thousands of arrests and locking up and stops and frisks as violence that's being perpetrated by the state on a group of people. And we don't view the harm that stems from it as anything worthy of our care and concern. People, when they get out, are supposed to shake it off. Go get your job, get back to work, take care of your kids, shake it off. But that is trauma. They've experienced violence, and many of them suffered over and over and over again, cycling in and out of prison. So, trauma and state violence. And then we have the interpersonal violence that exists in our communities, where people are struggling and failing in various ways to deal with frustration, anger, rage, sadness, grief, and taking it out on one another. Our answer to the ways in which people act out is to inflict more trauma, more violence, more harm upon them. Now, because you've harmed someone else, I am going to put you in a cage and lock you up and subject you to more trauma and more harm and more violence. I think we've got to have a serious conversation about what criminal justice means, what justice means in all of this. If our goal is to reduce harm, to reduce trauma, to reduce suffering, to reduce violence, then the answer can't possibly be to take a kid who's acting out, getting into fights, perhaps has joined a gang. His dad's in prison, he's joining a gang, trying to be somebody, feel part of something, feels pressure to pull a trigger, makes a wrong choice. Now, this kid who's lost and suffering, we're gonna teach him a lesson by inflicting more punishment and trauma and stuff. Perhaps we should ask, what would it mean to reduce harm in our communities? What would it mean and what would it look like to reduce trauma, acknowledge the harm that that young man may have caused to someone else? But how do we go about restoring, transforming, healing, and addressing harm rather than perpetuating cycles of violence and harm? And so that's why, I think that Danielle Sered's book, Until We Reckon, which is about really taking seriously the problem of violence in our communities, but also recognizing systems of mass incarceration as sites of violence themselves, are so important. Because we can't pretend to really care about violence in our community if our only response is to heap more violence, is to respond with more violence, which we know will cause only more trauma and make it more likely that someone will continue to act out in the future. Taking violence seriously doesn't mean figuring out how to lock more people up for longer periods of time to keep them off the street. Responding to violence in a meaningful way means taking seriously the dignity and humanity of everyone involved, taking very seriously the experience of the victim in a so-called, situation of crime, but also recognizing that the people we consider perpetrators or offenders of violence are almost always victims of violence themselves, and that this distinction that we've created between the victims and the perpetrators is a false one. And if we want to end violence in our communities, we're going to have to learn to reckon with violence in a way that centers healing and trauma, rather than simply the perpetuation of more violence and more punishment.
Thank you for that. Preach indeed. So we're surrounded by educators, and what's interesting, and we talked about this a little bit in the previous panel, but I'd love to hear what you all have to think. So often people, working with primary and secondary school students, don't have, when we're talking about political education, don't talk about these things with their students. It could be for a range. It could be operating under the pretense and the sort of fallacy that the classroom should exist as an apolitical space, and that having these conversations in one's classroom is inappropriate because it politicizes issues, and the role of a teacher is not to bring political issues into the classroom. Or it could be because they are worried that if you are having a conversation with young people about the history and legacy of slavery, the death of Reconstruction, the emergence of Black codes and Jim Crow, the sort of mass deportations and
They might become us if you did all that. They become
Say
us.
again.
I said if they learned all that, they'd become like us.
They become like you, right? And so that's my point is like, so how do you think about what it means to have these conversations with young people? And how can we, I think so many people, probably less so in this room, but so many educators believe that it is not their role to talk about these things with their students. And even those who might be sympathetic to the idea that we should talk about them might fear that talking about all of the historical oppression and the contemporary manifestations of oppression would make your students feel as if the world is against them, right? I've had conversations with teachers who said, if I tell my students all of these things, they'll just be like, well, the world is set up for me to fail. What's the point of me even trying? And this is not things that students have said. These are sort of imagined conceptions that the teachers have had. What would you tell teachers about both what this process of, we can call it political education, we can call it, telling the young people you work with how their communities have come to exist in the way that they do today, about what that process can and should look like. And that's for both of you.
Well, I don't think the fear is entirely unfounded in this way. I remember being in school and reading about slavery and Jim Crow and the whites only signs and feeling terrible. I remember feeling like, I cannot wait for us to move on. Like, I don't want to look at the pictures of the white only signs. I don't want to see the pictures of lynchings. I don't want to sit here and dwell on the fact that my people were slaves. I remember feeling that way. But I think when I look back on it, I realized a big part of the problem is that many of my teachers were well-intentioned, feel like you need to know this is history you need to know and understand, but they were only teaching part of the truth. Because it's true we were slaves, but we also learned how to survive. We don't teach kids about the resilience and the songs that were born in the cotton fields and the way people banded together and the slave revolts and the ways in which people overcame and survived against all odds, the acts of heroism and courage and resistance and resilience. And because we teach about the oppression and the suffering, without also teaching about how people survived and organized against the odds and made a way. I think we don't get to connect with our own strength, our own power, our own beauty, all of that. And so I think when we teach kids even about mass incarceration or mass criminalization, we can't just teach about the system and how messed up it is. We also have to be able to teach about what people are doing on the inside, organizing, prison strikes, what people have been doing throughout history to resist the injustice of the system, the movements that are being built on the outside. Folks need to be educated and taught how to organize. I was amazed when I was in law school, and I guess I shouldn't have been because it was true for me too. When I first started trying to organize, I was teaching it, it was considered a prestigious law school, and I would ask people like, well, if you want to work in a community doing social justice work, like, what would you do to get a bill passed? What would you do to make change? And people just look at you blankly, like blink, blink, like they have absolutely no idea how you would even begin to make change. And so I think if we teach only about the problem, but not introduce young people to the stories of the resilience and courage and the heroism behind bars and on the outside, and people who have been transformed and who are working through their own transformation, and teach people how to fight back, how to organize, how to find their voice, then yeah, we are just encouraging folks to feel depressed and powerless, and we're just reinforcing this notion that the system is against us and nothing can be done. But we have, over and over again, found ways to rise. And I think that is something that has to be taught to the kids, and that doesn't just mean teaching about Martin Luther King, once a year. It's about teaching young folks what it means to build movements, and the lessons that have been learned in the past, and introducing them to folks in their own communities that are engaged in that work, in inspiring and promising ways.
Yeah, and so I remember I watched Roots on TV when it was on the first time. I'm not gonna say how old I was. I was in elementary school. And I was going to a school. I grew up in Queens, New York. And there's nobody in the room from Queens. Nobody's representing, thank you. And I remember I was actually bused. It was a voluntary busing program. And so I was in bus from the black neighborhood to the white school. And I remember coming to school every day like, I don't like y'all no more. Like, and then there was only one white kid, Adrian, I remember her, who was watching it all week with her family. And she came up to me and she was like, I'm sorry for what my people did to your people. And I was like, I don't want to hear that. And so it was really changing for me because I literally was like, I hate them. Like, how could people do that to a people? But my family, we had this little den with like a couch in it, and we sat very close on the couch in front of the little TV, watching it every night and having a conversation about it every night. My parents made sure we processed it as we watched it. And my father did hate white people, so not all white people, but he was in the segregated army, so he carried the scars of that. My mom was an activist, and so those conversations happen. And so now with a 16-year-old daughter, like I had to struggle with this, like, okay, I know how I grew up. I know the conversation about race was always present in my household. Do I have that conversation with her? Well, unfortunately, I can't stop myself. So, because it's who I am, it's what I do. I think Roots had something to do with that, right? But being able to process, like Michelle said, and being able to understand what you can do, being able to have young people who are doing work, movement work, talk to young people is important so that they can see themselves and the ability to change and to move a country, even though they are 15 and 16-year-olds, because there's some incredible young people out there. That is important. The thing not to do, and I'm gonna talk to my white friends in the room right now, don't do one of those plantation exercises where the black kids get to be bossed around by the white kids all day. If you are thinking about something like that, check in with a black colleague first, right? Just to get a sense of whether or not that's gonna happen. I'm sure no one in this room would do that because you're here. But it really, like, seeing all those stories pop out this year was like, wow, people are really doing this and making young black kids feel some kind of way and be dehumanized in a classroom in 2019, even though those young people already know that and probably feel it every day when they're going into a classroom. But then to have a history lesson that takes them back to that is all kinds of wrong, right? So we've got to be doing this teaching, we got to be doing it right, we got to check in with people and connect them to what they can be doing.
Definitely. So the lesson here is, sounds like be intentional. Don't just plop your kids in front of a TV and have them watch Roots without talking about it, or have them watch 13th without talking about it. Just be intentional, scaffold those conversations. We are gonna move into questions from the audience. I'm sure you all have them. I think we have people walking around.
And Clint, can I just add something?
Yes.
We could go to Mike's, but I just want to add just something about, because we didn't really get to talk about police-free schools. And I just want to talk about that for a quick second. So this is a national campaign that we're building with the Alliance for Educational Justice. I brought along our report. I don't have lots of copies, there's a few around, but you can get it off our website. It's called We Came to Learn. It has an action kit that tells you how to get police out of schools. The idea is that we just After every school shooting, the quick response, the knee-jerk response is, instead of dealing with the gun control issue, is let's put more police in schools. Florida now has a law, 1 police officer in every school is a requirement. There are 1.6 million children pre-Parkland, 1.6 million children that go to school with a police officer and no counselor. And we have got to realize that those school resource officers, like I said, are cops, and that if we do not trust cops on the streets in our neighborhoods, why are we trusting them in the hallways with our children? We are, in a few weeks, if you go to our website, in a few weeks, we're launching another website that around We Came to Learn that also documents and maps the assaults of young people in schools. We've been tracking them, and we're only tracking them with the videos that young people are posting, because that's all we have to go on. And so we have the videos and the links to the stories. And even from January to the end of the school year, there were probably about 15 brutal assaults of young people by cops in schools, mostly Black girls. And I want to say to you, that's 15 Rodney Kings that happened. 15 Rodney Kings. We were upset about what happened to Rodney King. We better damn well be upset about what is happening to Black and brown children at the hands of cops in our schools. Young people who are being dragged down the stairs, teeth knocked out, tasered, chokehold, all of those things that we know that happens on the street is happening in our schools, and we're giving them a pass. And so we got to get them out of our schools. They don't belong there. We can get safety in other ways. And we can't look at training and all implicit bias. No, just get them out of our buildings. Thanks.
Yes. So once again, we only have time for a few questions. Please, no testimonies. And then we'll try to get as many questions answered as possible. Yep. Do we have microphones?
Hi, I'm Hilary Lustig. I'm a professor at Texas State University. I study restorative justice and racial equity. It's a huge honor to have seen you both today. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the recent School Safety Commission's report that called for more security and even arming teachers, and sort of denounced the need for examining racial disparities in discipline. Thank you.
Sure, it was a setup. It was a setup. DeVos wanted this. Parkland, like I said, a horrible tragedy happened, and they used it. And what they used it for was because they wanted to get rid of civil rights protections under the federal guidance. And so it was a ruse. And it just gave way for schools to get more cops, to arm teachers, which is horrible. But yeah, it's a ruse. And I think that for school districts, the important thing is to keep using that guidance. It is true. That is what, when you look at the guidance, the federal guidance, it sets out for you what discrimination looks like in discipline. And we've got to keep doing this work. We cannot let Betsy DeVos sidetrack us, because at the end of the day, she doesn't want to see public schools in this country anyway. She is all about vouchers and privatization. So let's ignore her and keep doing our work.
This question is from Michelle. Hey, Michelle, how are you? Good. I read your book. I love it. My name is Amir Barak, and I'm a formerly incarcerated person. I also was diagnosed with dyslexia while in prison. And I believe that it was my own self-imposed limitation that caused me to go to prison, right? Because I was acting out. It was my distorted thinking. I didn't value myself. I didn't value anybody in my community. Both brothers and sisters went on to do very, very well in college. So have you found that information throughout your studies, that men in prison that are dyslexic, like myself, did the same thing, act out? I mean, I wanted to get out of the classroom. I was very violent in the classroom. I didn't care about school. I didn't want to go to school. So it was I want to give the teacher some type of a little cushion to rely on as well, because we're kind of like hitting up on the teachers. But I want to say this, that it was my own self-imposed limitation. I did not like school, and I wanted you to know it and everybody else to know it. So have you found that?
I think there's no question that people who have learning challenges and disabilities are at much greater risk, not only of being pushed out of their schools, but also not knowing how to manage their anxiety and frustration and anger when the classroom is not designed to meet their needs and nobody is, capable of or willing to acknowledge that they need help in some way, kind of acting out in various ways. And, interestingly enough, I don't know if you've ever happened to read Cornel West's memoir, Living Out Loud, but it's actually a problem that exists kind of, at both ends of the spectrum in terms of people who have learning challenges as well as people who, are kind of advanced in a way that begin to act out. And in his memoir, Cornel West writes about how he assaulted a teacher when he was in school, and he acted out and was incredibly restless, and people thought he was a problem. And then it turned out that one teacher in the school said, I actually think that kid Cornell, he might actually, should test him. I think he's actually really smart. He might be, and they tested him and they found out like he was gifted in all these kinds of ways. And he was so restless because he couldn't sit still in the classroom and conform to what the teachers wanted him to be doing in the classroom. And the way our schools are set up today are designed to produce really assembly line workers. Like the entire design of public education today is, there's some interesting books written about the fact that the way schools are designed today are designed really to produce obedient people who are capable of working in factories on assembly lines. That's how modern education was designed. And it doesn't work for most kids. And some can tolerate it and manage to adapt to sitting in a classroom hours and hours, day after day, listening quietly and trying to take some notes and spit information back. But many can't. And for those who either have learning challenges or who, like Cornel West, was really ready for a different kind of challenge and was acting out because he was so restless, but he needed a different kind of academic challenge, find themselves acting out and getting into trouble and behind bars. And I think what you're pointing to is another dimension of the school to prison pipeline, which is that it's not just about identifying other ways to respond to misbehavior besides punishment, but us also looking at how do we educate kids? What do we do in classrooms to ensure that every child's needs are met, every learning style, every limitation is addressed, so that the full potential of all students is being, honored, realized, and responded to. And for many kids, when that proves not to be the case, folks wind up acting out because you're young and you don't necessarily know how to manage your emotions and your frustrations and your feelings potentially of failure. So no, you are not alone at all. And I know that there is, and perhaps Judith can speak to it, research that connects, different kinds of learning challenges and learning disabilities to school discipline, push out, and eventually getting locked up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, this gets to the point of needing more counselors in school who actually get to counsel and not doing 10 other jobs in the school. So that there's someone to identify that. Paraprofessionals in classrooms, all of those things, the supports that we need, because it is not just about the teacher, right? There've got to be other adults, and which is why we say that restorative justice is a culture, because someone should have early on said, hey, let's see how we can support him in this school, in this classroom. And there are places, because I forgot to mention, like Denver has a good restorative justice program going on where we have a pilot with them and the NEA. Teachers who are members of the NEA can come out for a visit to see how restorative justice is done in real time at that school. Oakland is doing some good stuff. And then in Florida, Broward County was doing really good work before the Parkland shooting around making sure that young people were not being arrested in school. And they had a program where their arrests were going down, their recidivism was going down, young people were getting the supports that they needed.
Good afternoon. My name's Kahari Mosley. I want to thank you for being here today, and just wanted to share a very recent experience for those who are from Pittsburgh, know a little bit about it, and kind of talk about the city of Detroit and how, through my experience, my personal experience and the experience that my wife has dealt with and we're still dealing with, I think in many ways is making Detroit kind of the Birmingham of the new Jim Crow. And what I'm talking about is a few months ago, me and my wife went to go see Nas with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Got back to the hotel. She went to bed. I stopped at the bar for a glass of wine. Realized I didn't have my room key. Went to get a room key, and the hotel, the Westin Book Cadillac, nice four-star hotel, decided that there was no way I could be a registered guest at the hotel. I asked for an escort to the room. I asked for them to go up and knock on the door. They refused to give me a room key. That culminated in them calling the Detroit police to the scene. In the 911 call, the hotel employee said that I was endangering guests, endangering staff. I was a menace. I may have a weapon because I keep reaching. The Detroit police came on the scene, detained me for a short time, and then ultimately escorted me to the room. You know, based on my treatment, obviously I was none too pleased. My displeasure, set them off, which culminated in me and my wife getting arrested that evening. My wife getting charged with 2 felonies for assault on a police officer, me getting 2 misdemeanor charges. This past Monday, I was acquitted of all charges by a jury of my peers in the city of Detroit. My wife, who is also the Allegheny County Controller, Chelsea Wagner, who's here, many of you know, is continuing to face her charges in Wayne County. And one of the interesting things about Wayne County, Harvard University found that Wayne County, Michigan, has one of the worst, if not the worst, records for juvenile life sentences in the juvenile system. And actually on March 19th, a week after the incident, we gave notice to the city of Detroit and the Westin Book Cadillac that we were going to sue them. And it was only then the next day in which we were charged by them. And when we went back actually to surrender ourselves, we were both incarcerated in the Detroit Detention Center. Very punitive move to kind of scare us. We were there for 12 hours. And that was that experience where we really got to see, you know, what you're talking about, Michelle, in your book. So many poor people just really being exploited by the criminal justice system. And only because we had the wherewithal to get an excellent legal team to fight that we didn't have to take the deal. You know, I was offered 30 days probation to walk away, and I respectfully declined, and I was told that if I didn't, you know, I might get a year or 2 of probation, have to go back to Michigan every month, you know, have to pee in a cup for 2 years, you know, have to go do 1,000 hours of community service in Detroit, and, you know, really, you know, hijack my life for a couple years. So I see how they play these kind of games and how unfair the system is. And as me and my wife were going through our experience, and obviously still going through it, you know, we really understood how important it was to continue to fight, because there's so many people that don't have the resources to hire a lawyer. And that's actually the vast majority of the people, and that's why they play the system the way they play it and try to scare the hell out of you, you know, with these very punitive charges, overcharging you, you know, scaring the hell out of you. I'm gonna have to do this probation or maybe even go to jail, so that you take that deal and then you make it go away. So I want to thank everybody. There's a lot of people in the room that deserve an applause for supporting us through that process, and we still go through that process. But I do want to say I think we do need to focus on what's going on in Detroit. While I was there during my trial, which was a 5-day trial misdemeanor, they said it might be one of the longest misdemeanor trials in the history of Michigan. 5 days for a disorderly conduct charge. So you can see how many resources get wasted in these very malicious prosecutions that go on. So I just want to thank everybody for, you know, letting me share my story and let folks know that we really need to focus on Detroit. On last Thursday, there's a gentleman named Willie Burton, who's an elected official who was arrested because he was speaking out against the facial recognition technology that's about to be implemented in the city of Detroit, which is very scary and dangerous. A city with an 80% African-American population looking to institute technology that shows that it misidentifies African-Americans at a 30% rate. And Willie Burton is like a civilian police review board. It's an elected office. He was speaking at a town hall, and the chair of the board actually had him arrested, charged with resisting arrest, charged with obstructing justice, just for speaking out at a meeting of a board that he was elected to be on.
So I just want to shout out, there's an organization in Detroit called Nation Outside that I hope that you and your wife will join, who do work around mass incarceration in Detroit. But
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. Please give a round of applause to these two brilliant women. And I believe we are transitioning into the next panel.
Before you go, please remain seated for a second. One quick announcement. In room 121, someone who was presenting also took with them a non-complimentary, but maybe to you complimentary adapter to change the slides. So if you could return that non-complimentary change, we would appreciate it. So let's give our panelists one more round of applause, please. So right now, our set is going to be changed so that we can move directly into our next panel discussion. And so as our panelists are coming forward, we want to just give just a couple of minutes. If you have to make one quick run, do it. But if you can stay, just please stay. We want to move right into the panel. We'll start immediately after.